Welcome. My name is Dr. Caroline Heldman, and I am a senior advisor for the Representation Project. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded by the great Jennifer Siebel Newsom. We use films and campaigns to challenge harmful gender norms and stereotypes. And this interview today is part of our hashtag Boys Will Be Boys series, which means that boys can be anything and everything they want to be without the constraints of restrictive masculinity. This is the Representation Project's love letter to boys and men, and I am so delighted to be interviewing a close friend and a friend of the org, Dr. Shira Tarrant. I am going to read her impressive bio, and then we're going to jump right into questions. Please use the Q&A to put your questions in at the end. We will spend all the time we need to get through those. So Dr. Tarrant is a nationally recognized expert on sexual politics. Her books include The Pornography Industry, What Everyone Needs to Know, Gender, Sex, and Politics, Men Speak Out, Views on Gender, Sex and Power, When Sex Became Gender, Men and Feminism, Fashion Talks on Dressing the Power of Style, and New Views on Pornography. Shira is just one of the leading experts, a go-to person, whether it's about the feminism, men, pornography, fashion. She has really an incredible collection of books on these various subjects. She also does a lot of commentary on gender issues, masculinity, pop culture, sexual politics. She's been featured on the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, NBC, Forbes, KCAL, Chicago Tribune, Baltimore Sun, Denver Post, Sydney Morning Herald, and on every radio station in Los Angeles, New York, Berkeley, and Houston. Dr. Tarrant received her PhD in political science from UC Los Angeles. She is a professor in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department at California State University at Long Beach. Welcome, Dr. Tarrant.
Thank you, Caroline. It's really nice to be here.
What a day. Okay, let's jump right in. Shira, tell us about your pathway to working on gender issues, especially a focus on men and healthy masculinity and gender equity work. When and how did you get on this path? So what's your story?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So let's see, early 2000-ish, I was teaching at Goucher College, which is outside of Baltimore, formerly a women's college, and it went co-ed. And I was teaching women's studies classes and assigning books that were super popular at the time and hopefully still popular with people, like Colonize This and Listen Up. And both of those books really had an impact on my female students because they're short essays that talk about first-person experience, and my students could really see themselves reflected in those essays. And so what happened was that I started getting one male student in my women's studies classes, and then another male student, and then by word of mouth, another one. I think it had something to do with the basketball team, shared by word of mouth. And I realized that I didn't have a similar kind of book to offer them where they could see themselves reflected in the essays, their experiences, identities, questions, concerns, worries, feelings, all of that. And so I saw an area that needed attention, and I thought it would be really valuable. And I created a very informal focus group, meaning we sat on the lawn on the campus. I gathered together some of the guys who'd been taking my classes. And I said, what do you think about a book like this? Would you read this? What would you want to read? And they really responded so positively. And that was the seed that became the writing that I was doing. Along the way, I want to add this side story, which was that I was having these conversations in class as well. Like, well, what about boys and men? What about young men? What, like, shrug emoji, what do we do? And I had this wonderful, wonderful student, Aviva Oken, and she said, hey, that's my dad. So Rob Oken, for decades, published and edited Voicemail magazine, and he just recently passed the torch. But that put me in contact with Rob and other really wonderful men who have been working in this area for decades. And so that just sort of grew from there. That's the genesis.
So it came from your students. Of course it did, right? I don't know about you, but I feel like I learn so much from them. I mean, nowadays it's mostly, Gen Z, social media or slang. term,
Yeah.
but it's just marvelous. Okay, so your students inspired you into that work. Let's talk about boys and men and young men in particular. Talk to us about the pressures that they face with restrictive masculinity. What role are media and social media playing when it comes to really reinforcing the man box?
Really great question. So to start, I want to say that I appreciate your use of the word restrictive masculinity. Very often, I mean, I don't have to tell you, you and everyone participating today understands that generally the word toxic masculinity is used. And I personally prefer not to use that because it sounds like something contagious or like disease-based or something like that. And so I really appreciate this idea of restrictive, like keeping us inside that box or keeping boys and men inside this box. So the pressures that boys and men face, they're tremendous. Not only is the man box still in effect, be tough, be strong, don't cry, don't hug, don't care, and all of that. But I think in addition, there is a struggle for the young adult men that I'm in contact with, or the youngish adult men that I'm in contact with. There's an additional pressure because I'm hearing that many of them don't identify with that man box and don't identify with masculinity in that way. And that is a risk. That puts them at risk. And they don't necessarily see where there's a place for them in feminism or in women's studies or gender studies. And so in a way, it's almost like the man box is a little bit bigger. It's a sign of our progress, but there are still constraints.
And what advice might you give to a young man who's encountering that? And just speaking, maybe if you had a student who is expressing some of that with you.
Yeah, interesting. Um, well, I would say, first of all, I try not to give advice because I don't know what's best for other people, but I do my best to listen and to ask curious questions and to do more listening than talking, which I won't be doing today, but I'll be doing more talking. I don't know that I have advice, but sometimes I will make suggestions about books and websites and resources that can offer support to those young adult men that I'm talking with.
Hmm, got it. Okay. So let's talk about one of your early, I don't know, loves, but certainly a big research agenda, right? Which is men and feminism.
Mhm.
You are the go-to expert on that topic. What role can or should men play in advancing gender justice? And why do you think it's a good idea for men to be involved in this movement?
Mhm. So men are invited and welcomed in, definitely. I don't know that it always feels that way for them. I don't know that it always feels that welcoming for women either right now. I would love to do an update on my book, Men and Feminism, because I think so much has changed between then and now, and there's still so much to be said. To start, um, there's strength in numbers. And that's for any political movement, any socio-political movement. And so it concerns me if we're coming to the table with a sort of checklist, like, do you meet this category and this identity and this perspective? And do you agree with me on A, B, C, and D? That's going to be really tough if we want to make social and political change, because there aren't going to be that many people who can check all those boxes. And that includes inviting men in and boys in to say welcome. I want to add to that add to this idea that there's strength in numbers for political movements and social change. I want to add to that and I write about this in my book, and I talk about this with my male students and students across the gender continuum, really. That there's a question that comes up about the word feminism or feminist movement or how people identify. And what I write about in my book is that I personally don't care what someone calls themselves, because if that word is what's getting in the way of ethical political action, then don't worry about it. And so some men who are involved with this movement prefer not to call themselves feminist because they see feminism as something that is for women and women identified people. Some men involved prefer to call themselves male allies or pro-feminist men. Some people don't like a label at all because they're sorting it out. And I think that it's really important that we give that sort of permission to not worry about that label. That doesn't have to be the most important thing because that's not the goal. The goal is not getting the title. Yeah, so I'll start with that. What else can I answer for
Yeah,
you?
I'm curious. I'm just, so you brought up kind of the checklist, right? And I think maybe you're talking about what a lot of us who've been engaged in radical activism for, older folks for a few decades are noticing that there's, the rise of purity politics and the rise of more restrictions on who gets to participate and have a voice. Would you say, since I want to say it's 20 years since Men and Feminism, right? Would you say that it's gotten harder for men to participate in gender equity movements and actions?
Yes and no. I think that there is more room for men to be involved with gender equity. I think it's somewhat normalized. It's not like, wait, who's this man in the room? And also there is there is an aspect of feminist movement that is very exclusionary toward men and to other people as well who don't agree or fall lockstep. And so both things being true. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, lots to think about. So I know you don't, you said you don't give advice, but let me just ask you. So you're a parent or you're a coach or you're a teacher, you're somebody in a position of power and authority who has influence in the lives of boys. What advice would you give them to promote healthier ways of doing masculinity?
Role modeling,
Okay.
walking the talk, being brave in that way, and letting boys and men see what that's like to be care-based, to be empathetic, to move through the world with integrity, which can be scary when it doesn't, fall in line with dominant culture, pop culture and social media, things like that. So I think role modeling, I mean, it's kind of a cliche term, but it does matter. Who do we look to, to fashion our lives? And so I think that can be very important. I think also being honest with the boys and young men and older men in our lives, honest in those conversations, even when we're stumped or we're afraid. I think that can be very important too, because there is that strength in vulnerability, and honesty can be very vulnerable sometimes.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And again, advice.
Yeah.
So young men in particular, are inundated with media and social media that's, the rise of the manosphere, the rise of the Andrew Tates and the kind of softer, gentler, but still very misogynistic Jordan Petersons of the world. How might you help them kind of intervene in that so that they're not influenced in that way?
That's a tough one, Caroline. That's really tough because it's such a powerful message that is infusing social media. I think it's important to provide space that is non-judgmental, so that especially younger boys and younger men can feel comfortable exploring and asking questions. I'll add pornography to that too, because we know that there is really, really troubling misogynist pornography, and we know that it's really easy access. I mean, I'm stating the obvious. So I want to put that in the pot as well while we're talking. I think that what I hear from the young college men that I'm teaching is that they worry that if they have questions or concerns, or if they find something appealing about Andrew Tate, or they want to explore that if they say it out loud, that they're going to just be canceled, that they're going to be called out, that they're going to be stepped on. And I think that silence is conversation. I think it shames. And I think then the issues go underground, so to speak. So in no way am I saying like rah Andrew Tate, not at all. But I'm saying there needs to be space for those uncomfortable conversations, where boys and men feel like they can say, well, yeah, but he's buff, or what, I don't know what the appeal is. He eats pizza. I don't know what, what people get. But there needs to be room for those conversations, and instead of just like, we don't say that name in this house, which shuts things down. Same thing for pornography. There needs to be room for more conversation, not less, so that we can explore and facilitate those conversations.
How do you create those spaces in your classroom? Because you're bringing up such a great point, right? And I think Jordan Peterson is maybe the best example where he appeals to young men who feel lonely, the loneliness epidemic. They're struggling with identity. They're struggling with their place in the world. There's getting these messages, right, that they are supposed to be in charge in a patriarchy, and then they're getting different messages from that they're not worth anything, right? So they're getting these competing messages that really leave them in limbo and in pain and alone and lonely, and their increased consumption of porn and video games has even, is accelerating that. And they click on a Jordan Peterson video because he is speaking to that loneliness, and then he blames the wrong people, right? He tells them that it's there are women and other marginalized people, transgender people who are doing this, who are the problem, right? So how, and this is the world's longest question, but how do we create, let's say you're in a classroom setting, and maybe this will be helpful for coaches and parents too, how do we create space for those sorts of conversations to happen?
That's a really excellent question. Well, ideally, I mean, you'd have to ask my students if this lands with them. I hope it's landing. One thing that I make an effort to do is to include content that focuses on men, boys, masculinity, not only the man box, not only, restrictive masculinity, or, hegemonic masculinity, or which is all very important, but also what it is that men and boys are struggling with, like suicidality, wage issues, and there are enough problems to go around. It's not like women have the monopoly, and it doesn't mean that talking about the struggles and challenges that men and boys face erases a focus on women and non-binary people, etc. But to lay that foundation to say, I care and this matters, and here's what's going on with boys and men, and say mental health and wellness and things like that. Examples of also content that I include in my classes, content around fatherhood, because there's a lot changing with caregiving and fatherhood, and some of it is because of capitalism and unemployment, and some of it's driven by those things, and also some of it is finally men are getting a chance to more easily do the caregiving and loving that they want to be doing. And so what I hope is that by including this, I'm providing content that is important, and I'm also setting a tone. I'm setting an expectation that your concerns matter here, so that when there are questions that boys or young men might have, there are more resources that they can tap into, and not only, the Jordan Petersons and Andrew Tates. So.
Well, to follow up on that, what would you recommend in terms of reading and resources? And I know you mentioned voicemail, which is great. Other resources you think that parents and young men should be tapping into?
Well, first of all, the series that you're doing, I have to say, I'm so impressed, and I'm so honored to be part of this. What you're doing is an enormous resource, real huge conversation starter. And I'm really a fan of conversation and things that get those dialogues going. I think that, I don't know if this is going to be controversial to say, but I think that Richard Reeves is doing some really interesting and important quantitative analysis. And again, agree or disagree, but there's a starting place to start having those conversations and to look at the data and things like that. So I would start with those two. And, to the best of our ability, if we can start changing up our own personal algorithms with social media, that can help as well. Yeah, maybe this is something that we could put together and brainstorm on in terms of resource list.
Great, and we can include that with this video in post. And it reminds me of this meme that's going around of women who, when their boyfriends, they're on a date or something, and their boyfriends go to the bathroom, and they'll lean over the phone and say, feminism, gender equality, get their algorithms moving in a different direction. which we all need. Okay, so let's jump into some questions, and folks, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. So Anonymous asks, how has the rise of social media shifted people's relationship to feminism and gender justice work?
Oh, thank you, Anonymous. What a great question. It's going to be, a little from column A, a little from column B, where it has expanded the conversation. I mean, I often have students who are quoting TikTok in our classroom conversations, right? So on the one hand, I'm like, yeah, like you're not having to learn it in this somewhat obscure university level class. You're coming in and this is part of the fabric of your life. Also true that some of that information is not quite as robust as I would hope. And also the backlash, easily thrives on social media. So both being true.
Can you
Yeah.
speak a little more about the backlash
Well, I mean, I think, I
for
think,
folks who are unfamiliar?
well, I mean, to start, I think the risk of speaking up or disagreeing or staking a claim is very scary because of call out culture, of cancel culture that is still happening. And so there's an implied backlash, even if someone's not impacted directly by it, there can be that fear, that internalized sense that it could happen, and so we self-censor. So it's as much about what actively happens as it is about what we don't put out there to avoid harm to ourselves. And that self-censorship is concerning as well. And also then there's the blatant takedowns and, attacks and really, and also, the nether reaches of the internet that I don't prefer to go to, is very, very cruel. So that's scary, I think.
So it sounds like you're advocating for call-in culture, right? More than call-out culture, cancel culture, to
Yes,
create spaces for conversation.
I am so, so on board with calling in. And my hope is that like in 20 years from now, that college students, I hope I will be retired by then, but someone else's college students will be saying like, oh, I heard that there used to be this thing called call out culture. What was that like back in the olden days? Because what I hope is that there is a shift in the zeitgeist where we collectively call in and engage, and meet each other where we're at to improve our society. Because otherwise, calling out, I want to say a little bit more about this, that, basically feminism is looking at the matrix of domination and how it oppresses us and how it seeps into our politics and our deepest corners of everyday life. Now, if we are calling each other out, to my mind, that is part of a matrix of domination. That's power over someone else. And I don't think we're really changing the paradigm if we're calling out. Now, the challenge is, how do we go about this and still hold people accountable for bad actions?
How
That,
do we do that without
yeah,
calling out culture?
yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know yet. I don't know. But I do think that listening empathetically, noticing when we're activated, like if I'm hearing somebody talk about something really foul, like something that just sets my teeth on edge, for me to first notice that before I'm reactively,
Mm.
lashing out, to notice what I am experiencing and to calm my own reactivity, I think can really benefit those dialogues. Even if I'm saying, hey, this crosses a line, time out. No. So I'm not suggesting that it's all like big hug, big group hug, kumbaya, but to notice these things. I
Oh,
think.
no, you're an activist who is very vocal and very critical of sexism and misogyny and patriarchy and its intersections and racism. So yeah, it's not, I mean, just to be clear, right? It's the specific side effects of call out culture, right? It sounds like you're really going after, which is the silencing effect. And, I find a lot on the left that there's, especially folks who are relatively new to social justice work, they want to demonstrate their, they want to get their activist points. They want to demonstrate their knowledge. And I think that's a really common kind of human impulse. And I think that's where a lot of the call out culture is coming from. And it's not productive, which is what you're saying. Yeah, it's not productive. It keeps people out of activism. It keeps men out of feminist activism. It does it across the board. depending upon what identity you're talking about. And it's just not productive because, as you pointed out, strength in numbers, of course, then we also need to be highly concerned about how we're doing it in a space. Like, men can't just walk into a, a feminist group and take it over, because that's not going to work. You have to do it in a way that respects the movement and respects your privilege and your place in that movement.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean you can't do it, right? And you're talking about this kind of silencing effect, which I actually don't think we talk enough about in activist circles. Having just witnessed so many people leave activism because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, or they feel like they said a thing, and instead of they said a thing that they didn't intend to have the consequences that it did, and it ended up being that something that ended their career or ended. It sounds like I'm defending people who've done terrible things, but at the end of the day, like, we're all on the same side, and how we do this activism matters an awful lot. Not only to sustain the movement, but to make sure the movement is as broad as possible. And yeah, people mess up a lot when you're talking about power and politics. And not to dismiss it, but that has to be addressed too, but in a way that doesn't exclude and doesn't silence.
Yes, yes. So well said. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm like, oh, this is a topic we haven't talked about, but it keeps so many men out of feminism, so many men out of gender justice work.
Yes, and that's what my students say, like, they're interested, they care. I'm seeing generational shifts in terms of where my students are coming from.
Me too.
And they also say, usually one-on-one when we're talking, office hours or, informally, that they're cautious, that they're afraid, that they don't even want to speak up in class, even when and because for these reasons, even though their heart's in it.
Yes. So how we do this work matters, as we're taking away here. Anonymous, we have a number of great questions.
Okay.
Claire asks, not anonymous, Claire, how can we better enroll men in these dialogues in an educational setting if they're not required spaces? Claire writes, I'm an educator at a nonprofit, and we struggle getting men, especially cishet men, to attend our programs around gender and orientation.
Yeah, Claire, thank you for that question. I don't know that my answer is going to be satisfying, because I struggle with the same question. For instance, I developed a class at the university where I teach, and the class title is Masculinities. I have been teaching it for years. I desperately want more men and male identified people in the class. I advertise, I have one semester offered pizza on the first day of class if you register. I mean, like, I'm good with the pizza lure, it's been
Andrew Tate uses it. We can use it.
Well, his backfired, fortunately.
Yeah, a little bit.
But yeah, so I just don't know. And I hope that over time, if we can create welcoming spaces that it's not safe space. It's not even brave space. I don't even like any of that stuff, but like welcoming, where like when the culture shifts enough that people know they can come and show up without personal or political risk of attack, that's an incentive. I think also, I don't know about nonprofit spaces, but for the universities, at least, with the corporatized university setting, get your degree in 4 years and out, it's really it's hard to pitch a class that's really the frosting in some ways, where it's not a required class. And I think that's part of what you're asking, not mandated. And I wouldn't want to mandate it. I'm going to give that question more thought, because there's got to be an answer. I just don't know what it is. So I'm going to think some more.
Well, James is giving us an answer for how to rig the algorithm. I love this. James writes, I have found an effective prophylactic against manosphere social media like Tate or Peterson or Joe Rogan showing up in young men's feeds. It is to actively subscribe to feeds like Misrepresentation or The Speech Prof or Creative Explained or We Are Man Enough. What are others that can be used to rig the algorithm? Any other ideas for rigging the algorithm?
What else?
Called Men.
Call Men, Ms. Voicemail magazine.
Is now National Organization for Women, Jackson Katz, other ways to rig the algorithm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
good, so fun. Anonymous asks, can you speak more to the generational shifts you've noticed in the classroom and with young people? Are students arriving with more knowledge around these topics?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like I said earlier, in part that's social media. Um, so students are coming in with more knowledge. They're sharing that interpersonally. They're sharing this knowledge in their relationships. They're wanting different things in their relationships. I know that my students are sharing stuff from class. I mean, sure you have this happen as well, that, our students share with their intimate partners and their family members, and it sends ripples out. And so this has been happening year after year after year. And I'm like, wait a minute, something's changed. So there's an awareness, there's a consciousness raising that's been happening. There's a savviness, not to mention generational ability to harness social media using all the bells and whistles.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, the folks who grew up with using these tools, it's another thing we learn from our students.
Yes.
Anonymous is asking about video games. Are there benefits of the video gaming community for young boys? On one hand, I've noticed that there are some games that seem to challenge gender norms and foster community, but it seems like the norm for young boys is violence, misogynistic games, and communities that push them further into the man box.
Yeah, this is going to be another both and
Yeah.
response. Yeah, for sure. 100%. There is misogynist, violent gaming communities, all of that we know is a problem. And very actively, there are pro-social communities among gamers. I count my daughter's partner among them. So I'm not a gamer, but through him, I become aware of, um, the communities, international communities out there of not only men and boys, across the gender continuum of people who find each other, who love gaming and who don't love misogyny. And that's an active commitment that they have. So both and, yeah.
Yes, and I'll tie in a study that we did with the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media, which is also a thing to break the algorithm. Follow them, GDIGM. We did a video gaming study, and it found exactly that with focus group conversations with boys. They found community. They felt less lonely, and of course, there was all sorts of misogyny and racism and homophobia and xenophobia and everything you can imagine, that phobia showing up not only in their headset, but also watching Twitch, and popular gamers were using a lot of this language. And what we found was that when really popular gamers would use homophobic language, for example, then the number of homophobic comments in the chat would increase significantly in the few minutes following that. So there's definitely it's a both and. Right? It's a place for community and a place where they're learning maybe some values that we wish that they at some point hopefully will wish they didn't learn either, can unlearn. Dr. Judy Chu has added Movember and everyday sexism as other accessible entry points for boys and men. We're going to have the best list here. And I'll add the female quotient, our friends over at the female quotient, to that as well. So lots of ways to break the algorithm. Did you have another idea for breaking the algorithm?
No, but I was thinking about your upcoming guest, and I think he'll have some good ideas too next week with Matt, who's been very involved with online space, and there's a new app. I'll leave it to him to to roll that out. Yeah. I like this conversation. I think that it's time for a big list.
A nice long list for breaking the algorithm.
Yeah.
A few more questions. Anonymous asks, do you have suggestions for how to protect our children from the way society teaches them to be boys and girls? It feels like no matter what you do at home, the world gets a hold of them and the gender roles get their hold.
Yes, so really super interesting that you're asking this, Anonymous, because my daughter's grown, but I was recently thinking about when she was little, and she was part of a very progressive child development center. It was based on the university campus where I was a student at the time, because I was young mom, so also student. And it was intentionally non-sexist, non-violent, child-centered, active listening and all of that. The parents tended to also be on board, otherwise it wouldn't be a good fit. Where I'm going with this is that the kids would, go along doing their thing, being free, being kids, 2, 3, 4, and then they went to kindergarten. And the kids went to the same kindergarten across the street. Something changed. Even though they were still with their same friends, they were still with their same progressive parents. All of a sudden, the girls would only wear pink and purple. The boys, they would took on a little manly, that kind of manly role. And the parents, we were like, what is happening? What's going on? And this opened up conversations about how this the pressure and how broader culture seeps in no matter what the context is of the social group of the kids, the social group of the child development center, the social group of the parent groups of, and so again, I am a huge advocate of open conversation. And so for better or worse, I hope for better, the kind of parenting that I did was, oh, wait, all of a sudden you want a Barbie, you're gonna you have to have a Barbie doll. And I'm like, oh, what? And so I got the Barbie doll, right? But it came with a long conversation to and from Target, to open up that dialogue.
Yeah.
About what it means.
About proportions and values and
Proportions,
body
values,
image and
body, yes, without shaming and without saying no
yes.
and without denying, and hopefully without being too didactic. You could ask her, I don't know, but more conversation so that little kids are growing up to be big adults with discernment skills.
Yeah, Barbie literacy, media literacy, porn
Yes.
literacy. I mean, goodness, yeah,
Yeah.
they're going to access it anyway. And I think maybe that's the heart of what you're saying, which is you can plan as much as you want as a parent, but unless you're off the grid living in the mountains somewhere, they are going to have access to that. And I say this as, someone who was a kid well before the social media age, well before, who was homeschooled, who didn't have a TV in the house. It didn't matter. I still got access to everything that kids around me were getting. It's I think it was about a decade ago, we started to see the data coming out that kids are spending more time with media and social media than their parents. And so just in terms of sheer amount of time, let alone the fact that, that it's more impactful, let alone the fact that that media tends to be more entertaining than your parents. So yeah, of course the impacts, I mean, nobody can, maybe it would be impossible to really weigh that, but we know kids are spending more time with their devices than their
Yeah.
parents.
Yes. And so, I want to touch a little bit briefly on porn literacy because you mentioned this and it's something that I've written about and published about. I am a huge advocate of porn literacy. That's a tough argument to make because it's risky. But my argument is based on the fact that we could hate pornography and we could have a very strong political argument against it. Kids are going to find it. And what do they do when they do? I mean, similarly to drugs, we can say just say no. But what happens if you just say yes once and you're like, oh, well, that was fun. Are we giving kids skills to understand what they're desiring, what they're wanting, what they're seeing to make sense of it and, in an age appropriate way. So I think that is important to put on the table as well. And bringing it back to boys and men and healthy masculinity porn literacy has everything to do with that.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a question from Anonymous and then come back to your ideas for porn literacy. So Anonymous asked Dr. Gail Dines of Culture Reframed is a leading expert on the porn industry, men and boys' engagement with porn, and the patriarchal, racist, oppressive structures that force and coerce women into porn. She writes about your work as being individualistic, sex positive, right, approach to porn. So I'm curious to know, right, this is you and Gail Dines are kind of on two sides of this, but actually I think you're speaking. Can you just talk to us about that divide? Talk to us about how you're speaking to each other, maybe in ways that people who want to bifurcate this aren't picking up on, and then talk to us about what you would tell young men in terms of porn literacy.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so Gail and I go way back in terms of writing about pornography and talking about pornography. We know each other. We have each other's phone numbers. I will say that I teach Gail's stuff in my classes. I don't know that
Love her stuff.
Yeah, and I don't know, and Bob Jensen's stuff too. I don't agree with all of it, but that's not the point. Circling back to, the top of the hour, we don't have to agree. We need to understand how to disagree in constructive ways. I think that Gail and I get positioned in opposition, and I will say that she has said things about me that I find really cross a line and misrepresent me. That's academia. We're trained to do that.
We are trying to do that. And you and I'm in the Gail, I'm in more the radical feminist camp too. You and I are supposed to be at loggerheads about this too, but and can I just jump in here for a second?
Yeah.
What I find when you and I have a conversation is, we were just talking a few weeks ago about this new data coming out from Peggy Ornstein about how 1 in 4 heterosexual women are afraid to have sex. And that has to do with non-consensual choking, strangulation, right? Which is, that's battery, and also with surprise anal sex, which is rape. And you and I agree on this. And we agree, and you brought this up earlier about the misogyny in porn. And so what I find is that you and I are incredibly worried about the same thing, which is that porn is the primary sex educator. As Jensen and Dines have pointed out, they have great data on this, that it has gotten far more violent, misogynistic, because it's based on an addiction model. It's a capitalist addiction model. And so they're upping the ante. And you and I are both very concerned about the impact of that, not just on young boys and young men, but on girls and women as well. So just to jump in to say, I mean, I think actually the concern is the same. The approach is radically different, but please proceed.
Yes.
Interrupt me.
Thank you. Thank you for that synopsis, because I think that you reflect my position very well. And I do think, like you and I don't agree on all points, but we have points where we really do agree. And I think in terms of modeling, what a great modeling of ways that we can have these robust dialogues. My concern about porn, so Gail's organization has changed names, but the focus used to be, and this, I don't want this to be about Gail. This is not an ad hominem situation.
Her work is awesome. This is
She's
foundation.
been doing this for a long time, right? Yeah. So I want to give her credit where due. But what I noticed was that here's what I noticed was missing to my mind. Talking directly to adult performers, talking to people in the industry, legitimizing the industry as an industry, not that we have to like the industry, but that it is an industry. So like the tobacco industry, we don't have to like the tobacco industry, but if we consider it so taboo that we don't even consider it as an industry, then we're not going to be talking about what's going on behind the scenes. So my work has been focused on establishing the industry as an industry and getting the information when and where we can. It's not easy. Also, if we say just stop watching porn or stop porn now, my concern is that's like saying stop Disney now. I mean, Disney's changed over time. The tropes have been modulating, but people aren't going to just stop loving a Disney princess just because we say it's sex. This is a sexist trope. What we can do instead is open more conversation. And so that was always my intention. Also, I think there are real concerns about censorship and free speech, because love it or hate it, pornography can be the sort of canary in the coal mine in terms of authoritarian, repressive incursion on free speech. So we do differ in that way. But that said, I advocate for more conversation, not less. I don't prefer the sort of Nancy Reagan just say no version, because like I said, we say yes one time and we have no information to help us understand what it is that's going on with ourselves and our desires and our curiosities and all of that.
Well, I've come over to that pragmatic side too, in the sense that in terms of entertainment media for young men and boys, it goes video games in terms of the amount of time they're spending, video games, and then porn, and then like TV and movies. And I would like, and I get criticized for kind of normalizing the industry, but I would actually like to hold the industry accountable for it's racism, it's sexism, it's fat phobia, it's homophobia, all of those things the same way that we do film and TV. Like Gina Davis puts out, reports on this. Annenberg Inclusion Initiative puts out reports on representations in film and TV. The Representation Project does, the Diversity Report. I would like that for the top porn videos, because what happens when what happens when it's the second most popular form of entertainment media and we don't talk about it as an industry, it then goes unchecked. So I want to take all of these checks that we have put that have dramatically shifted the content of film and TV, and that pressure, that consumer pressure, I want to put that on porn, because I think people would be appalled if they knew how much violence and how much racism was in the most consumed pornography available, or the fact that 52% of women porn performers after performances end up seeking some sort of medical care. I mean, we could really have a long conversation about where we agree on this. And I'm so Anonymous, I'm so glad you brought this question up, because I think, Shira, I mean, you're a pragmatist, right? You actually want to address the problem, but through a very different approach.
Yes, and an approach that I hope offers opportunities to meet people where they're at, to foster that communication and dialogue. I want to add one really quick vignette that came to mind while you were talking about racism in the industry years, and this relates to Gail as well and goes way back. Years ago, I did a series of interviews sort of in response to Gail's book, and I interviewed Cinnamon Love, who has been in the industry for a long time. She's a Black female performer. And I asked her view on racism in the industry. And what she said was, I don't experience racism. And if there are racists, I don't work with them. Well, that was years ago. Fast forward, she is doing some fierce activist work around racism and anti-Black racism, specifically in the industry. And what I hope is that whatever it is she said to me in the interview way back when, in some way is part of the story arc of opening up possibility to have this conversation and for her to do this work. I don't mean because of my interview with her, but just like helping to shift the culture so there's room to have that conversation, to your point about the industry.
Yes, thank you. And I will just send everybody to the Representation Project's report called 10 Rape Myths in Media. We actually have a conversation about porn there, because we look at how it is, promoting sexual violence against women, especially when virtually every act of sexual violence in pornography, the porn performer is shown to either not be bothered by it or to enjoy it. So just want to put that out there. There's some good data there. I think we even cite you. We certainly cite Gail Dines and Robert Jensen. One last question from Anonymous. What research do you wish existed when it comes to understanding boys and the way we fail them as a society?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. I think that there's really increasingly wonderful research that's being done about how our boys are doing and thriving and flourishing or not. And Peggy Orenstein, her work is really wonderful in that regard. I think I would like to see even more that gets to the heart and the emotions of boys, not only like what are their grades in school or what are their aspirations for after graduation, but like really how they're feeling and really how they're doing. And that is increasingly the focus of my work, shifting to mental health and emotion and wellness and holistic well-being. So I would like to see more of that as well.
And Dr. Judy Chu does some of that work, but so much more work to be done on that.
Yeah.
And can I ask one last follow-up question since we have time? You had talked earlier about suicidal ideation, and you just brought up mental health now. What would you say are some of the factors that are driving the mental health crisis for boys and young men today?
Well, I think there is a sense of despair. I think that it's not unique for men and boys. There's a fair amount of despair across the board. But I think as well, the man box, when and where it exists, that constrains boys and men and prevents them from, it's not just like saying what they want to say or relating in the way they want to relate, but even getting in touch with what it is that they desire. in that regard, that they're wanting to connect, that they're missing connection, that they feel prevented from connecting. So to even have that awareness in the first place is not something that I think we're supporting to the best of our ability in our culture. I think that's one of the leading components. So
Great way to end this interview.
yeah,
Thank you, Dr. Shira Tarrant, for your time, your wisdom, your expertise. So appreciate your work.
thank you. What a great conversation. Thank you.
Woo! Take care, y'all. We'll see you soon. Thank you.